Hi, everyone. Welcome to day one of the 4th Canadian Language Advocacy Day celebration. My name is Deanna, and along with my lovely co-host, Amal, who so graciously accepted to co-host last night, we'll be hosting for the day. For those watching online, simultaneous interpretation in French is available for the duration of the session. To turn it on, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says interpretation, and you can toggle between the language of presentation and the language interpretation. Founded in 2021 to advance linguistic equity and inclusivity while fostering understanding and cooperation among diverse language communities, the Language Access Coalition of Canada has been playing a pivotal role in promoting language diversity. February 22nd, Canadian Language Advocacy Day is envisioned as an annual platform for celebrating the rich, multilingual tapestry of culture and languages. This year's focus is on language revitalization, both on the profound histories and vast knowledge of Indigenous languages on the land today called Canada. The efforts to promote mother languages in newcomer linguistic communities and the bridges that connect the two communities. Against the backdrop of the International Mother Language Day on February 21st, we will engage in enlightening discussions that underscore the critical need for access to and preservation of all languages. As we gather to honor and cherish the linguistic wealth of our communities, LAD 24 promises to be a day of not only reflection and appreciation, but also our collective commitment to fostering inclusive, multilingual connections among people and cultures. We'd like to acknowledge our first main sponsor, MCIS Language Solutions, for their vision and commitment to this cause over the past 4 years. Here's a short message from MCIS's Executive Director, Lata Sukumar.
Good morning, everyone. This is Lata Sukumar from MCIS Language Solutions. I'm sorry that I'm unable to participate in these days of action, Language Advocacy Days, February 21st and 22nd. As MCIS's Executive Director and us being the main sponsor, I just was invited to leave you a message. So I do hope you have a fruitful 2 days coming together and contemplating some of the challenges that lay ahead, challenges and opportunities, challenges because of AI and the ethics that'll be involved in working with AI in our profession, but opportunities in terms of using AI to preserve our languages, Indigenous languages and newcomer languages, and also to look at ways in which we can foster human connections using technology in much better ways, augmenting the skills of our language professionals using these technologies. Thanks very much, and I hope you have a wonderful 2 days of intimate discussions and policy outcomes so we can change the landscape of this industry. Thanks. Bye.
I'm going to do an Indigenous land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the space we are in is on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabeg Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory and uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. Further, we respect and affirm the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land. We have and will continue to honor the commitments to self-determination and sovereignty we have made to Indigenous nations and peoples. We acknowledge the historical oppression of lands, cultures, and the original peoples in what we now know as Canada, and fervently believe we can contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey we all share together. This land acknowledgement was developed by members of the Algonquin community, and we thank them for their generosity and collaboration. We kindly thank the unsung heroes of many conferences. People who help with accessibility are often unnamed language professionals, interpreters, and translators. Today, we have with us 3 agencies helping us to promote inclusiveness and accessibility. are French interpreters from MCIS, ASL interpreters provided by the Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service, and the Langue des Signes Québécoise interpreters provided by another great agency, Interprétation Signes et Paroles from Gatineau. Again, if you're using social media channels to share your experiences here today, please use the hashtags LAD24, IMLD2024, and No Language Left Behind. I would now like to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Sarah Onyango. Sarah has been a well-known figure on the Ottawa community radio and television scene since the 90s. Ms. Onyango is the producer and host of the monthly African cultural program Fonton From on Rogers Television Channel 22 in Ottawa, as well as of the shows Ici l'Afrique, Africa Revisited, and Black on Black on CHUO 89.1 FM, the University of Ottawa's community radio station. A longtime advocate for Black history, culture, and causes, she has served on the board of directors of Black History Ottawa since 2002 and is a volunteer presenter for the United Way East, Ontario's Community Builder Awards program, as well as co-chair of Welcoming Ottawa Week. Thank you, and I'll pass it over to Sarah to introduce the panel.
Kwe, bonjour, hello, habari in Swahili, and oyaore in my mother and father tongue, which is Luo. It's a language spoken around Lake Victoria in at least 5 different countries. What you didn't mention in my bio is, apart from being a community media professional, I'm a translator. I'm a language professional, like many of you in the room and many of you online, which is why I was very honored to be asked to moderate what is going to be a very rich and robust discussion. We are pleased to have the following panelists, and I would first like to introduce Thea Harris, who is going to be focusing on language revitalization efforts. Thea is a language program manager at First Peoples Cultural supporting strategy-specific language programs. Thea is a member of, oh my goodness, I will completely massacre this, Snuneymuxw First Nation on Vancouver Island, BC, and uses her background and education in Indigenous business and interest in community capacity mobilization to support her work. Welcome, Thea. After Thea, we will move on to Rebecca Ingram, who is going to be talking to us about education and geography with regard to language preservation and revitalization. Rebecca received her PhD from Carleton University School of Linguistics and Language Studies. She currently works at Carleton as an instructor in the linguistics department, as well as in the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center, where she focuses on community-based revitalization of Indigenous languages and knowledge through digital mapping. Welcome, Rebecca. Next, you already met Dr. Elaine Gold, who presented the beautiful panels from her museum. Elaine Gold initiated the founding of the Canadian Language Museum in 2011 and oversees its operations. She brings to her work at the CLM a PhD in linguistics, an MA in art history, and strong experience in arts administration and curatorial work. Dr. Gold taught linguistics at the University of Toronto for over 20 years. She has lived in central, western, and northern Canada and is dedicated to promoting and protecting this country's rich language heritage. She is the recipient of the 2019 National Achievement Award from the Canadian Linguistic Association and of a Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Medal in 2023 for her work with the Canadian Language Museum. And last but not least, Laila is going to be talking to us about newcomer perspectives. Laila Jude is a communications manager with Refugee 613. She leads project planning and implementation, including expanding content creation and curation for settlement and sharing learning with communicators and other stakeholders. Laila is also an immigrant from Syria with international experience in video and TV production, as well as working in NGOs for social change. Welcome all our panelists, and we're going to start with Thea, who is online. Welcome, Thea.
Hey, wow. Aitkweel, good morning. Ait Konasilam Namla. That means it's good to see you in my language, Hokamino. I'm just going to take a moment to start to share my screen here. Okay, so thank you for inviting First Peoples Cultural Council and myself to be here on this very important day, International Mother Languages Day. At FPCC, we say that in this work, we stand together, and it feels very fitting to be joining you virtually as we celebrate the diversity of backgrounds and languages present in the room and online. I'm feeling today like we do truly stand together. As was shared with you, my name is Thea Harris. I'm a program manager at FPCC, and I come to this work through Indigenous business and an interest in Indigenous rights, sovereignty, and nation building. I was born and raised in Coast Salish territory. That is the territories of the Lekwungen and Sianu people. But my family actually comes from Snuneymuxw First Nation and Cold Lake First Nation. I also come from mixed European heritage on both my mother and my father's sides. And again, I'm just so grateful to be here with you today. And thank you for kind of starting us in that good way with an acknowledgement. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm calling in from Sianu territory today, and I'm privileged to be able to work on Vancouver Island at our office that is located on the beautiful traditional unceded territories of the Saanich people in the village of Huachatlip. And I just want to take a moment also to just hold up and celebrate the speakers that hold on to their languages. We celebrate you, and you're holding on to those languages. So before I kind of get into my presentation, I want to share a little bit about First Peoples Cultural Council, our story, our vision, and our mandate. And it starts in 1990 when FPCC was formed with the support of First Nations leader and government, who at the time decided it was the best way to guarantee ongoing support to preserve BC arts, languages, culture, and heritage. FPCC is an Indigenous and community-led organization. Our board and our advisory committee are made up of BC First Nations people. And you can see depicted on the right here how our programs and services are directed by community needs and inputs, such as external peer review committees, board of directors, and an advisory committee representing the 35 languages of BC. We also do in-person visits where we're able to get program feedback and feedback to make sure that our programs are meeting the needs of communities. Our vision in this work is that First Nations languages, arts, cultures, and heritage in BC are thriving. The knowledge and worldviews expressed through First Nations languages, arts, cultures, and heritage are valued as essential to our collective well-being and our human rights. And beyond that, we are more than just a funder. We're known as a funder in this area, but we also offer training, coaching, resource, and assistance directly to communities, often walking alongside them in this really important work of revitalization. We provide customized community-based programs and opportunities outside of K-12 education programs, which is maybe where a lot of us are familiar with where some language work happens. And we're able to provide a proven model for our community partners in BC and around the world. And we support revitalization through arts, heritage, and language programming, which I'll discuss shortly next. So the FPCC Arts Program supports traditional and contemporary artists, arts creation, strengthening, and arts infrastructure through the programs you can see listed here, supporting individuals and collectives and community organizations and First Nations infrastructure and musicians. We also have our heritage program, which works to empower communities to steward their heritage through our grants programs and by providing opportunities to bring people together to share knowledge. So we support Indigenous cultural heritage stewardship, infrastructure, conservation, and development, mentorship, and knowledge sharing through these programs as well. And finally, our language program. So our language program really kind of has three streams where we support the creation of speakers through our mentor, apprentice, and youth empowered speakers programs, immersion programs, our silent speakers program that support people who understand but maybe don't speak their language, and our open strategy program that supports things like NEST, community-led projects, and adult immersion. We also support language planning. We firmly believe that communities have the agency and sovereignty to determine the future of their language, and they express and explore that through the planning program, creating long-term plans for the revitalization of their language. And then we support documentation through language technologies. In addition to our programs, training and support, FPCC monitors the status of BC First Nations languages, arts, and cultures and heritage in BC. In 2010, FPCC published the first report on the status of BC First Nations languages and has since published additional reports in 2014, 18, and 2022. These assessments can be used as a powerful advocacy tool, and they help us understand and measure the progress, where people are going. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, understanding how we see the impact of revitalization efforts through the status of BC First Nations languages in this assessment. It supports to educate the general public, helping people understand the language, the complex language landscape of BC. And it supports community mobilization, gets everyone kind of going in this really important work. And it's important to see the reclamation taking place in communities all across BC. We also offer online tools such as the First Peoples Map, which you can see here, and you can access online at the link there below. It's an interactive online tool that promotes First Nations languages and Indigenous artists in BC. It includes profile artists, public art organizations, and cultural heritage points of interest. A really amazing tool that you could spend so much time on as you kind of explore different areas, points of interest, languages, and even hear the pronunciation of greetings in different languages. And then we also offer toolkits. So these toolkits have been developed by the FPCC program staff and are freely available on our website. They contain a collection of practical resources to support the development of arts, language, culture, and heritage revitalization programs in First Nations communities. So you can see we have the Heritage Stewardship Toolkit and the Language Revitalization Planning Toolkit and Language Nest Toolkit. And I encourage you to go check those out. Really informative. And again, really community-led resources that support this revitalization work. And finally, we have our First Voices tool. And so First Voices is a digital hub of web-based tools and resources that FPCC developed to support Indigenous peoples and communities with language documentation, teaching, and learning. And you can access it on firstvoices.com. So that's a little bit about who we are. And now I want to take some time to talk about revitalization work, why it's important, what it is, and what are the impacts, what do we see? And before I get into that, I want to explore, I'd like to explore this kind of idea of why language matters. It's important to take a moment to talk about why language matters, because languages are very unique and within them hold intrinsic values and beliefs which are transmitted and communicated. If values are important to emotional well-being and mental health, community wellness, then we know that the language which contextualizes and holds those values is critical. Language is rooted in the land and the water. Our language is shaped and has been shaped by these lands for time immemorial. It contains guidance about how to be in relationship and right relations with the land and water, how to listen to them, how to thank them, and how to live in reciprocity. Language is also connected to our health as a vital role in the mental, physical, and emotional health of First Nations communities. It connects us to our culture, to our history, our spirituality, and the land, which are the foundations of personal and community wellness. We've seen in instances where Indigenous languages are spoken can have real effects on health, such as lowering rates of things like smoking, diabetes, or mental health issues. And languages are resilience. Resilience is the ability to remain strong in the face of overwhelming challenges. Connections to tradition, to language and culture can build resilience and support healing from history of cultural and linguistic repression and loss. Studies on resilience have identified language, traditional beliefs, and culture as significant factors of success. Our languages have been shown to fortify Indigenous people against stress and strengthen well-being. And language is a source of knowledge about health and well-being. As we reclaim our Indigenous languages, we learn more about the land, about the medicines, the waters that can teach us more about our own health and our well-being and the health of the land and that of our communities. Language is a critical part of the cultural values and beliefs that are essential to the emotional well-being and mental health of community. We know that language also strengthens our minds. It's so important to our brain health. Being bilingual actually helps the brain and often leads to more advanced communication and social skills. Studies have shown that Indigenous children learning their Indigenous language can actually enhance their overall academic performance. And bilingual children have displayed a noticeable advantage in working memory, as they tend to have more flexible minds and be more tolerant and balanced in their thinking. And later in life, bilingualism has been reported to be associated with the later onset of things like dementia. It's also believed that having your Indigenous language increases cognitive abilities such as attention, control, focus, and conflict resolution. And finally, language is part of our identity. It teaches us who we are and how we want to live well in this world. Our language and culture provides healing and builds strong identities as First Nations people, and community-based programs that provide cultural opportunities and pass on language and traditional knowledge will help build positive identities and resilience for community members of all ages. So why this work is important, we know that language, arts, and culture are interconnected with every part of our life. Indigenous people, for Indigenous people are essential to our well-being. Our cultural heritage and arts and language are a living expression of our identities and critical to who we are as people. So what is First Nations language revitalization? Well, simply, language revitalization includes any kind of activity that works towards reversing language shift. We know that it's a community-wide effort, that it touches everyone and everything, and that it requires a holistic approach, including all domains. And you can see the domains here. You can see all the different people, and it's not even a fulsome picture. I think there's probably more that you could add to this, but includes, adults, elders, children, and away from home members. It's not just in the school, it's in the ceremonial hall, in the lands and resources department, economic development, the health center, and in sports and recreation. So successful language revitalization includes the development of comprehensive plans and community infrastructure, again, that touches all of these places and includes all of these people. It requires specialized skills and training, dedicated staff, and demands ongoing and sustained support. How it was explained to me recently by a language champion in my area was that this is an ecosystem, and we need to help and support to create that ecosystem so that we can see languages thrive. And we know this is really urgent work. We're here today because we know that it's really urgent work. Knowledge holders and fluent speakers are aging, and opportunities for intergenerational transfer are becoming more limited. And cultural historic sites and practices are being lost due to climate change and weather-related events. So we know that this is really important work, it's urgent work, and that it takes all of us in all areas to do this work. But what are the impacts? What are the impacts when we see language revitalization? Again, be holistic, incorporate all people. And these are some of the impacts that I was talking about earlier that can be seen from our language status report. We work together with communities, and it's having an impact in helping many communities revitalize their languages and cultures. So, for example, in the 2022 report, there are more than 10,000 people who can speak their language. The number of language learners has grown 20% to more than 17,000 people since 2018, and up 50% since 2010. And most recently, something that we just had the privilege of celebrating is the reawakening of the Puntlatch language, BC's 35th living language, a language that was declared extinct when the last speaker passed away in 1940, or what we would call a sleeping language, is just celebrated its reawakening, and the community has declared it a living language, which is just an incredible success. And importantly, we hear from many funding recipients that the work that they're doing is life-changing. Autumn Cooper from Tziminis First Nation says, the power you feel learning your language, there's no words for it. You feel so much more connected to your culture in so many more ways because of your language. And in this work, we support emerging language leaders. So you can see a youth here, Ayana Twig, a young person from Ktunaxa Nation in southeastern BC. She's learning the Ktunaxa language. And she says, my generation has the ability to reclaim our languages and identity. As a young person, I feel it's my duty to learn and pass on this information, since those that did not have that right, or that did have that right taken away, fought so hard for us. I want to continue that flame, and hopefully one day we won't have to fight anymore, and we'll be able to speak and practice our culture without feeling the despair and worry that we'll lose our identities. And another incredible language champion here, Sophia Terbasket Fundmaker. I just wanted to share her kind of vision as I come to a close here. She says, over this decade, I would dream that there is an immersion school for families in every nation, that there is one language domain and only the language is spoken there. I see places of language transfer as sources of hope. So as we bring myself to a close, I just kind of want to leave you with this, that authentic First Nations histories need to be told in First Nations voices, that First Nations language, arts, and heritage are interwoven, and support is needed across all sectors, including all people. And First Nations cultural heritage in Canada is integral to UNDRIP, and this work is critical for the health and wellness of First Nations people. So with that, I want to say Haichka or Haitsebka in my Hokomitnam language. Maybe you can see a thank you in your language there as well. And just encourage you to stay in touch. You can subscribe to our newsletter or contact us with the information on the screen. So again, Haitsebka for having me and hearing what I had to say. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was an amazing sort of taking notes. But during the Q&A, we're going to get more information, sort of a fill in the blanks for any aspect of Thea's work that you're interested in. And next we have Rebecca, who's going to focus on the education and the mapping piece of revitalization.
Kwe, bonjour. Sewa gwego, bonjour. Good morning, everyone. As I usually begin everything that I do in North America, I would like to acknowledge our current location on traditional unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. I'm also acknowledging that I live right on the border of Algonquin territory with my husband's people, the Kanien'kehá:ka, just to the east. He is actually here with us this morning. His name is Tohahande. It's right in front of us. I'm sure he will make his way into some of my slides at some point. Just want to begin with a brief outline of who I'm going to be discussing in this talk this morning. So I am currently a senior research associate at the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center in Carleton, just across the river. I am an instructor in the School of Linguistics and Language Studies. Might use this for my courses later. And I'm currently the coordinator of the Atlas for Kanien'kehá:ka Space, which I will be discussing this morning. Dr. Gahande Horn Miller is my research partner. It's also my PI. She is also Kanien'kehá:ka. She is from Kahnawake. She is the Associate Vice President of Indigenous Teaching, Learning, and Research at Carleton and an Associate Professor in Indigenous Studies, and we live and work literally quite close together. She's my neighbor. I'm actually going to be starting off by discussing a bit of what Thea began, and that is discussing Indigenous knowledge systems and how language comprises a part of those. Indigenous languages are not only methods of communication, but also extensive and very complex systems of knowledge, and these have developed over millennia, generally in a specific geographical location. They're central to the identity of Indigenous peoples, the preservation of their cultures, worldviews, and visions, and they are an expression of self-determination. When Indigenous languages are under threat, so too are Indigenous people themselves. And we see this firsthand in our work. So this in particular is a quote from the United Nations, and I'll be using more of this later. UNESCO defines Indigenous knowledge as the understanding, skills, and philosophies developed by societies with long histories of interaction with their natural surroundings. This is generally acquired during travel and trade. It's also through acts of cultural significance, for example, potlatch, in the process of gathering sustenance and materials. The picture in the background there is of wild rice harvesting, which is something that we did with the Anishinaabeg of Rice Lake. Place is emphasized in the Assembly of First Nations definition of Indigenous knowledge. And that states that it reflects particular conditions of unique cultures and peoples in specific geographic locations. So discussing the land and the water, and as Thea said, the land and the water shapes the language. This is all based on collective cumulative experience, so over generations this knowledge is acquired, and as I said, it's in a very long period of time that's passed from generation to generation. Oops. So we know that they're transmitted from generation to generation. They come out of these very complex knowledge systems. However, it's also important to note that they are expressed in many formats. What does that mean? So language, for one. However, ceremony is knowledge. Artistic creations, artifacts are all Indigenous knowledge. So the picture here that you see is from Akwesasne, which is where we spend much of our time. And this is the making of an ash basket from the white ash tree. And that process went dormant for some time, especially where the language is concerned, and now is stronger than ever. This includes history, law, spirituality, agriculture, environment, science, medicine, animal behavior and migration patterns, art, music, dance, craft, construction, and more things that we probably haven't even thought of yet. One of the ways that this knowledge is passed from generation to generation is through language. So those are my arms. I was very lucky to have both Tohande and my daughter assist us when we went out on the lake and we learned how to harvest the wild rice. Some of this knowledge, like oral histories, place names, songs, and rhymes, are expressed directly through language. However, a lot of other aspects of Indigenous knowledge, like agricultural practices, ceremony, governance practices, and craft, are expressions of knowledge and culture whose understandings are facilitated through language. The example here, this is my niece, and she is holding what we call a wampum belt. It is made out of whelk and what else am I missing? Quahog shells, thank you. And these are strung together, as you can see. Some of these are treaties. A lot of these are agreements. Some of these tell specific stories. These are all aspects of Indigenous knowledge. They're just shaped a little bit differently than we would think of in the Western world. So the Kanien'kehá:ka community of Akwesasne that I just mentioned earlier is famous for its basketry practices. In the process of finding the right tree, knowing where that tree is growing, of creating the splints, of cutting it, of soaking the splints, and then finally how those are woven together, it's not directly dependent on language, but when you pass that information from person to person, especially from adults to children, we generally use language to teach that process. In fact, I do it myself. So I watch videos on Instagram to learn the information from my own ancestors' territory, which is generally England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. And I am trying to revive those practices on my own. We try to use wattle in our garden. There's no way that I'd ever be able to do it, but I do very much enjoy thatched roofs. And this is a process called needle binding or naalbinden. And the mitts that I'm wearing today, I made using this particular process. Sometimes the link between language and knowledge is less obvious because it's been influenced by or it's borrowed by other languages or cultures. This is true in particular of, for example, Indigenous place names. How many of you know what Canada means? What does it mean? What did you think it means?
I think it's the village of
It means the village, Ganada. This is actually a result of a misunderstanding. Cartier first appeared and said, "What do you call this place?" And they said, "Ganata, it's a village." Nobody was wrong. What about Ontario? Does anyone know what Ontario means? Ontario is a word that comes from Wendat, which is spoken primarily on the North Shore of Lake Ontario. It means Ondio means it's the main body of water. It's the big lake, the big one. There's a similar word that we use in Ganyat Dario, but it doesn't quite mean the same thing. Ganyat Dario means a beautiful lake. Sometimes these are used interchangeably, but we have the records that say that this is originally from Wendat and that it means the really big lake. How about Quebec? Uh-oh. Quebec means the Narrows, and it is from Algonquin. It is a reference to a very specific place, and it kind of got turned into a very large metaphor. This is the place that actually is Quebec City. And you can see in this area here, the St. Lawrence River becomes very narrow at that point. That's what Quebec means, at the Narrows. None of you are allowed to forget this now. One of the ones that I've worked on quite a bit is Kahnawake. So again, that's Gahande's home community. And the translation is approximately at or in the rapids. It's not quite right to think of it that way. Because what happens is just because we have a translation for something, and I'm in a room full of translators, so you'll all understand what I'm saying, just because there is a translation does not mean that it captures the exact concepts that we're talking about. Kahnawake is a discussion about the way that the water moves unexpectedly, that there's some kind of pressure somewhere that's pushing the water away from how we expect it to move. That's what creates the rapids. So that tells us about how Kanien'kehá:ka people, and Haudenosaunee people in particular, understood the way that the water moves. Now, the two places where these rapids, where the places were named for the rapids, no longer have rapids. Those rapids have been cut off. In the case of Fonda, New York, what's now called Fonda, the Erie Canal has gone through, and there are no longer rapids at what used to be Kahnawake. The same is true at the bottom here is Kahnawake in Quebec. And Kahnawake in Quebec was cut off because the seaway was put through. Neither of those two locations are any longer at or in the rapids, but we know where the rapids were because of those names. So place names show us inherent knowledge of the landscape through the language. Indigenous knowledge such as place names are passed intergenerationally in the course of children learning about their culture, about their history, and about them acquiring that language. And language ties together people and places and practices culture and knowledge. So if Indigenous languages become dormant or entirely lost, we lose a unique view and all of that knowledge of that specific landscape, and often this spans over thousands of years. In the case of a place like Australia, 60,000 years. So we understand now why Indigenous languages are important, especially from an environmental perspective. So what do we do to preserve and revitalize them? Thea was discussing some of the techniques that they use and promote. So for example, mentor-apprentice technique, language nest. We decided to do something a little bit different. And the goal was to try and reconnect the knowledge, the land, and the language. And what we came up with is called the Atlas of Kanien'kehá:ka Space. It's online right now. You're welcome to take a look at it anytime. And what we've done is we've created a map. And in this map, we go to the community and we ask them to tell us what they know. Sometimes this is written down, sometimes maps have been made about it, sometimes it's not. So here, for example, we have a point. On this particular point on the map, we have put an old map, a paper map that was created of the area in the GIS project in 1997. In other places, we've actually put video. In this case, this is Ryan Ransom, who's from Akwesasne, and he's one of our community partners. And we sat down and we tried to figure out what some of these names actually meant. So this one in particular was giving us a little bit of problems because we both understand some of the language, but we just couldn't get it right. He actually called someone on his phone and said, "Can you tell us what this word means?" And they were able to give us a breakdown of that word. In real time, we took a video of it and we put the video of the word breakdown on the atlas. Anybody who wants to know what it means and why can just go and watch the video. This is another location, the east end of Gawanore, which is the island neighborhood of Akwesasne. For those who do not live on their ancestral territories, such, for example, as Tohande, you don't need to go there. You can see what it looks like by clicking on the map. And one of the things that we do now, oh, sorry, it's going to keep going. So these are some examples. Did I already do that one? I'll keep going. What we do now is we get the youth that live in these communities to help us do that. By doing that, when we pair them with language speakers, they're learning about the language and they're learning about what happens and what happened in their community and why it's called that. So we're going into our third, or I can't remember if it's our third year or fourth year. Is our fourth year? That's why I have him. He can remind me of what year it is. Our fourth year of our summer camps. And what we've been doing is we teach the campers, the young people, how to use drones. They go out and they choose the location that they're interested in, whether it's maybe their family had a farm in a specific location, and every year they did maple syrup harvesting, or whether it's, I just like this particular place, or in some cases, it may be where a ceremony took place. We teach them how to document these places using the drones. They go out, they fly them around, they come back, and they talk to the language speakers, and they learn what they know about those places. And in the process, not only are they learning about their own territory, the environment, the ecology, the animals, they're also learning the language. So the elders are taking their knowledge and giving it to the children, to the youth. And the youth are learning how to describe what they see and what they do on the land using Kanien'kehá:ka. This is essentially mentor-apprentice technique where we're using technology to facilitate that. We also have a heck of a lot of fun. We also do other fun activities. I made a scavenger hunt for them in the language. They get to learn more vocabulary. This is a picture of us on a pontoon boat, and we're making cordage out of nettles, which is also something that my ancestors practiced. We've done tie-dye with natural dyes. What else have we done? Fishing. Tohande takes them fishing. They learn each of the fish. We also have an underwater drone that we use to spy on the fish, which they don't particularly like. But anyway, it's fun for us and fun for the kids. So again, I put the third year. Apparently it's the fourth year. I can't keep track anymore. But the methodology that we're using right now, the entire point of it is, A, to prove that it works. I can tell you with certainty that it works. I have had 3, 4, 5 family members who have come to the camp and left speaking some aspect of Ganyak Geha, which to me I did not think was possible, but they have actually left speaking some of the language. I have never seen anything work like this in my life. I still don't entirely believe it, but it's true. I don't believe it to the point where I wrote a paper and it's going to be published in the Canadian Journal of Applied Linguistics this year. And the entire point of all of this is for other communities to be able to use this methodology to do what we're doing. To date, we have over 200 points on the atlas. We have something like 400 different pieces of media. And every single one of us has learned some aspect about Akwesasne in particular, which is where most of these are based, that we did not know before. So we're really excited about it. We have another 2 years left on this grant. And what we're working on right now is finding other communities that want to try this technique so that we can figure out how it can be expanded and how it can help to revitalize both language and landscape knowledge at the same time. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Gahande is also on the Carleton website. And we would be very happy to talk to you. Gichmikwich Nyawa. Thank you. Merci.
Wow, that is amazing. And I hope we can advocate so you can get more funding and expand the program, because experiential learning, really, like myself, speaker of an African language that is not written a lot or read a lot, very oral, is very key, especially for young people. Thank you very much for that. And, okay, let me see. Next, we have Elaine Gold. Elaine Gold with the use of museums as bridges and cultural interpreters and connectors. Dr. Gold.
Okay. I think we're ready to begin. And so I just wanted to say with this slide that the Language Museum focuses on the celebration aspect, so celebrating newcomer and indigenous languages. But we like to think that our celebration and sharing knowledge of these languages helps promote language maintenance and language revitalization. So in this talk, I'm going to speak a little bit about the museum, our traveling exhibits program, our exhibits within the museum, then give you a bit of an overview of Indigenous languages in Canada and newcomer languages in Canada, and talk a little bit about the shared challenges and different challenges that they have in maintaining their languages. Next slide, please. So I don't think I have to make a big argument to this audience about why a language museum for Canada. We obviously have a long history of bilingualism in the country with official languages of English and French, over 70 Indigenous languages from coast to coast, and more than 200 immigrant mother tongues, with 21 of them with over 100,000 speakers. And our government policies, we do have policies that do support bilingualism, multiculturalism, reconciliation, revitalization, and some language policies for language maintenance. Okay, next slide, please. So these are our founding goals. And you can see we want to share information about the many languages of Canada, raise awareness in particular about Indigenous languages, promote language maintenance, and facilitate dialogue on fundamental language issues. Next slide. So we have now 8 traveling exhibits. As I mentioned before, we'd be making them about 1 per year, and you can see their titles here. Obviously, We have the Inuit language one here on display, one about the Cree language, one about Canadian English, one about French in Canada. We only have one traveling exhibit right now about an immigrant language, and we chose to make it on the largest language in Canada, which are the Chinese languages by far. Then we have one about dictionaries in Indigenous languages, one about 150 years of the history of language in Toronto, and the one that's in the image here is called A Tapestry of Voices Celebrating Canada's Languages, and it's an introduction, if you can imagine, in 7 panels to all of the languages of Canada and some of the important language issues. Next slide. So our exhibits have toured from coast to coast to coast. We're very proud. They go to libraries, community centers, universities, small museums. And I think one of the best places where we reach our audience are at libraries, because we find that every community, pretty well every community, no matter the size, has a library. And people who might not normally go to museums, who might not have access to museums, go to libraries. And there's a lot of programs for new immigrants in libraries. So I really enjoy having them in libraries. And on top of that, the libraries enjoy having the exhibits because they can supplement them with the books that they have, put out their books that they have. So in particular, this exhibit here is in a library in Fort Vermilion, Alberta, a small community, and they can put out whatever materials they have about the Cree language to support the exhibit. On top of that, have special programs. And I love this picture because it's children learning more about their heritage language, about Cree, and that connection between culture and language. So they have a drummer there, they have the children, the exhibit's up. It warms my heart. Next slide. So we also have special exhibits in the gallery separate from the traveling exhibits, and within our gallery space, which is in Toronto, and it's in the Glendon campus, on the Glendon campus of York University, we have had several special programs about immigrant languages. And in particular, this is an immigrant language that's been in Canada a bit longer than some of the others. This was about Yiddish. And you can see we had a very big crowd coming to the opening of this exhibit. And we created buttons that say, in Yiddish, says, I love Yiddish, ich liebe Yiddish. Okay, next slide. Also very important to promote discussion about different language issues. In these images on the left, we just had an art exhibit of 15 artists across the country who created works in response to the words of the national anthem, and in particular the words home and native land. And we wanted to continue a discussion about the words of our anthem and whether they are appropriate, whether they are welcoming for new Canadians, whether they are appropriate for Indigenous people, and perhaps what words should be changed in our national anthem. So that was part of the discussion that we promoted with this really beautiful exhibit. And we have an exhibit coming called Grounding States of Gender, which, as you can see, is in Farsi writing. And so this artist, what we want to talk about is the fact that writing is also art. It's also an art form, not just a form of communication, but also that the words can be very powerful and deal with very difficult issues. Next slide. We also have a lot of resources on our website. So we reach people through our website, of course, as many people do. And so the booklets, I have a few here that you can look at. Very proud to have made this booklet about Indigenous languages in Canada, an overview. And it's free for download on our website in English and French. And then there are another number of videos that have been made for the museum, mostly by graduate students. And this one, important issue, Tirawamp and preserving Indigenous languages in Toronto, but the challenges of maintaining Indigenous languages in an urban environment. So that's interviews with a number of different Indigenous people about their experiences trying to maintain their languages within a city. Next slide. So now just a very, very quick overview of Indigenous languages in Canada. So this is also from the Tapestry exhibit. And it's a spiral that just illustrates the 12 language families that the 70 Indigenous languages in Canada are divided into. And you can see a very big red circle at the top, and that's an illustration of the Algonquian languages, which are by far the largest. And the next one, the Inuit language, and then coming all the way around to our little smallest circle for the language isolate for Kootenai, and showing the number of speakers. So the largest languages are Cree, and then Inuktitut, and then Anishinaabe-Moan, Chippewa. Next slide. Well, this is from the most recent census. So there's different ways to think about the health of a language. So one way is to think about the number of speakers, and I just mentioned the three biggest in terms of the number of speakers. But another thing to think about is how many people report speaking that language at home. Because it's speaking it at home, that's the way the language is passed on to the next generation. And when you look at those responses to the census, suddenly you see Cree, which had more than twice as many speakers as any of the other Indigenous languages, does not have as many speakers at home, reporting speaking at home, as for Inuktitut. So then you start thinking about, well, which language is doing better right now at maintaining itself or carrying it into the next generation. So you have to think about that. And of course, when you look at the smaller languages, like Michif or Haida or Cayuga, there's no reports of them being spoken at home. So this is something of great concern for maintaining the languages. This other colorful mosaic on the side was created by Stats Canada. It's on their website. But again, it's another way of thinking about the health of a language. And this was mentioned by Thea earlier, is whether there are fewer or more speakers than at the last census. So this is what it's showing, comparing 2021 to 2016. In the kind of yellow beige ones here, those are the ones that are approximately the same number of speakers as in the last census. What you want to look for is the blue, because if they're blue, that's showing more speakers than in the last sentence, and some cause for optimism. And the ones, a lot of that blue, that increase in speakers, number of speakers, is because of second language learning. So second language learning is becoming very important in the Indigenous communities, so people not learning the language at home, but now, as you already heard, so many programs for young people, for young adults, to learn the language that they might not have learned from their parents. Next slide. So now looking at immigrant languages, these are the 21 languages that have over 100,000 speakers. So when we compare it to the Indigenous languages, remember none of them had 100,000 speakers. So Cree was reporting 85,000. Well, 21 languages here in Canada with more than 100,000. And then when you look at the largest ones, like Punjabi, Mandarin, Arabic, Cantonese, Punjabi and Mandarin around 700,000, and then Arabic, Cantonese, Spanish, and Tagalog around 600,000. Like, these are a lot of speakers of these languages. And then even when you get to, and I don't want to say smaller by any means, but the languages more closer to the number of Cree speakers, so 100,000 for Greek, Bengali, Romanian, it's not quite the same situation. You say, oh, well, it's about, Cree has about the same number of speakers as Greek in Canada, so that's pretty good, right? But when you think about these languages, like Greek, if they're having trouble passing those languages on to the children, they can actually, if they have the funds, perhaps fly back to Greece and see some more Greek speakers. Or they might be able to have a Zoom call with some family in Greece, and they can reinforce their language. They might be able to get some teachers from Greece to come or send for some learning materials. Indigenous languages can't do that. What's here is here. In some cases, there might be a few speakers in the United States of certain languages towards the southern border of Canada, but otherwise, they have to rely on their own resources. So even though the numbers might look similar, not exactly the same situation. Okay, next slide. Just to briefly look again, these are numbers now from 2021, and looking at the 3 largest languages in each province. And just what I want to point out, which you can't see because it's just showing 2021, is that in 2016, you saw Indigenous languages more. So no longer in the Yukon, there is not an Indigenous language that's in the top 3, whereas in 2016, there was. And I'm pretty sure in Nova Scotia in 2016 that Mi'kmaq was the 3rd, and it's now been surpassed. So there's those changes that you see. And when you look at Nunavut, the number of English speakers is quite astonishing, and really a big change, and reflects both immigration, that there are more English speakers now living up in Nunavut, but also reflects language loss of people switching to English. Next slide. I like this image of the houses, also from the Tapestry of Voices, because it gives you this visual image of languages spoken at home. And so, not surprisingly, English is the biggest by far. Now, this is from 2011, but the relative sizes would be very similar today. So English by far the biggest, French about the 3rd, the size of English. So that's homes where English only is spoken, French only. But when we talk about bilingualism in Canada, what does it mean? And it's that 3rd house that shows you that English and another language is the biggest in terms of bilingualism. So it's not English and French. English and French goes, you got to go 2 houses down more to get to English and French for being spoken at home. So bilingualism in Canada is primarily English and another language. Next slide. So the museum, we do some projects with immigrant languages, and we're part of Newcomers Day in the City of Toronto, which is this fabulous event where thousands of newcomers come to Toronto City Hall, and there's all sorts of booths set up for social services. And then we're a little different, so our booth set up about language. We had the tapestry exhibit up, and then somewhere people could sign and write welcome in their own language. And you can see this is just part of the poster, but there's over 20 different languages here that people signed on the poster. It's a great day. Next slide. Our exhibit about the history of languages in Toronto also makes you think about what languages do you see on the street when you walk down the street, because people also get support from seeing their language around them and having that reflected back to them. And so we were looking for signs that reflected the languages spoken, and this sign is probably about 20 years old. Do not feed the birds, and it's in 5 languages there. And what we like about this sign is that someone came and scratched it in Russian at the bottom. So do not feed the birds. So again, reflecting a new language or a growing language in Toronto. Next slide. Typical view of northern Toronto, where you're seeing Farsi, you're seeing Korean, and again, these languages definitely being reflected in the Toronto streets. Next slide. But you also have to think about what you don't see very much on the streets. And you don't see many signs in Indigenous languages in the streetscape. And Toronto put up a few, but not very many, Anishinaabemowin street signs. So you can see just above the word for Davenport Road is the word for that trail, a very traditional Indigenous trail in Toronto. So it's there, but there aren't very many. And this reflects, how people feel about their own language. Next. Our exhibits do obviously acknowledge language loss, and we talk about residential schools and the devastating effect that they had on Indigenous languages. And this just shows how linguists think about languages that are extinct, or better described as sleeping here, because we just heard about a language that might have been considered extinct but has been brought back and spoken. So sleeping or dormant, languages that are endangered, and languages that are viable. And even though Some of these languages, like Dene and Cree, are large, and we might be described as viable. They're all, in a way, at risk because of the very big influence of English and French on Indigenous languages in Canada. Next. So I want to mention just a few of the shared challenges of maintaining languages between newcomers and Indigenous peoples. So they're all living in a country with 2 official languages, and these languages are both very large international languages, so they're getting culture in both of those languages, and so that's a very similar challenge. The parents who speak these languages might have experienced racism and have some shame in speaking their own languages, and so do not want to pass them on to their children. Again, parents might, I think it's more important that children learn an official language, become very fluent for success, and many parents worry that speaking their own language at home will somehow hold their children back. And this is something as linguists that we try to dispel that attitude, but a lot of people feel that way. And then there's limited access to teachers and reading materials in their language, and that's a very big thing for Indigenous languages, is training teachers and reading materials. There are a lot of reading materials for kindergarten students, but if you want some good reading materials for a 14-year-old, that's a lot more difficult to find. And if you want people to continue with their language, you need materials for them. So this is a big challenge, and also obviously for immigrant languages as well. And then if you're within a very small community, even if there is a teacher or access to materials, you might not have the funds to support any sort of language program. And finally, there's the attitudes of the children. And some children might be resentful of the extra hours of schooling and somehow feel that their parents' languages aren't relevant to them or to their culture. And that's also something, a shared challenge. Next. So, we've heard a lot about revitalization, so I don't have to talk to you about revitalization. It comes from the community. But this is a wonderful poster for summer camp for the Plains Indian Sign Language, which is also an endangered language, so put that up. And then a very beautiful picture of a slaving language class in Northwest Territories. Next. And then some materials. Well, this was a booklet that we created. It's about teaching Yiddish. So it's about some history of teaching Yiddish in Canada. So it's not actually a school book. It's about that, but it's something that we created. And then this wonderful booklet that came out of Toronto, and it's a book with stories in 7 different immigrant languages, so written by people from those communities, illustrated by people in those communities, and translated into English and French. So there are some materials available, and I just wanted to point those out. So thank you. I think that was my last slide, and I look forward to discussing this with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gold. And I have to say, I buy children's books in my mother and father tongue because we have the same issue. We don't have necessarily age-appropriate material in my language. And I read them to make sure the language stays in my psyche. And last but not least, since you ended with newcomers, we're going to hear about newcomer perspective from Lila Jude from Refugee 613.
All right. Is it still good morning? It is still good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Leila Jude, and I'm the communications manager at Refugee 613. Well, specifically for the Newcomer Information Hub, which I will be talking to you about today. I'm very happy to be here. It's been a pleasure connecting with everyone on this panel. I'm now really inspired to do better with my 4-year-old, who's been refusing to speak Arabic with us at home, but I will do better, I promise. And It's been a pleasure connecting with Eliana and the team at MCIS, who have, you've been working hard, obviously, to make today happen. So thank you for inviting us. And again, I'm super excited to be able to share a little bit more about the work we do at Refugee 613 with multilingual resources to make settlement information more accessible for newcomers. Next slide. Sorry, I'm confused because I'm moving the slides here and okay. So again, before I begin, I'd like to also acknowledge that the land on which Refugee 613 is based is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on Turtle Island since time immemorial. We are grateful to have the opportunity to be present on their territory, and as a team, the staff at Refugee 613 we are continually exploring how our organization can better support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities and their rights. Next slide. So one way we have recently done so is by partnering with an Indigenous organization called Circles for Reconciliation to produce digital content in multiple languages to explain the meaning of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. A lot of newcomers don't know a lot about that day, especially when they first arrive in Canada. And of course, we plan to do more in the coming years. If you're interested in sharing this infographic in your network, you could just simply scan the QR code. It's available in different languages. Or you could simply visit our website. You could see the URL here, but I'll also share a QR code for easier access later on, if you'd like. Okay. So today I'll start by telling you a little bit about Refugee 613 and the work that we do. Then I will talk about the work that we do at the Newcomer Information Hub, how we create multilingual resources for newcomers, and more specifically, I will focus on the language aspect. And finally, I will talk about how making content available for newcomer audiences in their preferred languages contributes to what we call information equity. So, next slide, please. Thank you. Who are we? So, as Canada's leading migration communications organization, Refugee 613 connects newcomers and the communities that welcome them with key information on life in Canada. We focus on identifying communication gaps in newcomer welcome and the integration experience, and we develop the tools to address those gaps. We believe that the more informed everyone is about services, policies, and key settlement topics, the stronger our collective welcome and our communities will be. That's why we're always asking questions like, who is getting the information that they need? Who isn't? Is this content meeting the needs of its target audience? And if not, then what can we do about it? So we take essential information on areas like health, employment, housing, and more, and make it more accessible to newcomers by producing simple, clear resources in plain languages and translating them into many languages and distributing them through digital channels. We also do research into newcomer audience habits and preferences and test new approaches to digital messaging services, and then share our knowledge with others in the settlement sector and beyond. Next slide. Refugee 613 also convenes settlement and non-settlement partners, both at the local and the national level, to close information service gaps and foster collaboration for refugee welcome. The grassroots work informs how we support partners across Canada to meet the information needs of newcomers. And no matter what we're working on, we are always trying to help others who work with newcomers practice strong communications with and for newcomers. You will hear the word newcomers a lot, but that's what we do. Next slide, please. So the Newcomer Info Hub, or Newcomer Information Hub. We know that many newcomers struggle to access basic information when they need it and how they want it. And as communicators, we apply general principles of strategic communications, and one of them is to meet your audience where they are. For us, that means in using the languages that they prefer. Our Newcomer Info Hub project, funded by Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC, produces clear, culturally relevant information and connection to services, translated into many languages and accessible at our multilingual info bank or online via digital messaging services. Next slide, please. So it's a national project, and when it first started in 2020, the Info Hub was focused on producing COVID-19 content, so sharing information for newcomers on COVID-19 topics. So it was apparent at the time that traditional public health communications strategies were failing to reach many immigrants, especially racialized and refugee newcomers. We produced a very successful series of vaccine bulletins in multiple languages to help newcomers understand the benefits and risks of getting the COVID-19 vaccines. We then started creating more content and building on our earlier work in digital messaging for settlement and integration, where we developed and shared best practices for using digital messaging platforms like WhatsApp to share settlement information with newcomers in their preferred languages. What began during the pandemic has evolved into a content creation hub, developing multilingual material across a range of settlement topics. We are still implementing and testing the impact of our multilingual content and navigating the best ways to go about evaluating them. I will later talk more about the language aspect of our content production process at the Info Hub and what we have been doing with it so far. Next slide, please. Just wanted to show a couple of examples of recent infographics that we've created. We create content in multiple formats, videos, for example, audio, but the most popular is infographics. So you see the one on the right is in Rohingya, about the flu season, and the one on the left is in Dari, and it's about public libraries. I'm glad Elaine mentioned public libraries. A lot of newcomers, when I was a newcomer myself, I had no idea that public libraries provided amazing free services. So that was a popular resource. You can find those online in many other languages, including Arabic, Creole, Pashto, traditional and simplified Chinese, English, French, I think Hindi, Spanish, Swahili, Tagalog, and Ukrainian. I might have missed a language or two, but I'll share as well a link for how to access them at the end. Next slide, please. So, some data. Data is always good. Our research and our practice as communicators has confirmed that what we already know as a team of professionals, many of us with lived experience of migration, language is one of the biggest barriers to effective information delivery for newcomers, which often leads newcomers to choose community networks over any official sources when deciding where to go for their information and who to trust. This is some of the recent work, like research that we've done in audience research. In March 2023, we conducted research to better understand the information needs and habits of newcomers to Canada. As part of the research, we surveyed almost 200 newcomers across the country, and the results showed that close to half of them preferred to receive information in their mother tongues. Immigrants who self-reported as coming like through the refugee streams, or I believe also different pathways like temporary work visa or international study, said that they're more likely to prefer receiving those information in their mother tongues. We also conducted 2 focus groups as part of that same research, one for Haitian newcomers and one for Ukrainian newcomers. And participants from both groups shared that language barriers pose a significant challenge for them when trying to access and understand information that they need in their preferred languages, or information that they need for their settlements, and that they prefer to have those information in their preferred languages. And the same is true for Afghan newcomers. Based on the results from additional focus group we conducted in early 2023, to better understand this demographic, Afghan newcomers said that language barriers make it hard for them to access and understand essential settlement information. So this data and many more that support it is what really fuel our content production processes at the Newcomer Info Hub. Next slide, please. So I will specifically talk about language and how we work with language when we produce content for newcomers. When we are creating any kind of informational resources, our goal is not to only make it in multiple languages or make it multilingual, but we also produce content that is in plain language. This means it's written in a clear, in an informal way, with as minimal jargon as possible. No jargon is preferred. And this will make it easier to understand. We also use professional translators and make sure to give them some kind of instructions on the tone and the language we would like them to use while translating. However, simply translating information is not enough to overcome language barriers. Translation is as much an art as it is a science, and I believe you've touched on that in your presentation. So we do an extra step. We like to call it an extra step. It should be an essential step. So we do what we call community reviews. A weak or bad translation can destroy your audience's trust in you and the information you are providing. We arrange for a member of the target community or the target audience to review the translation, to let us know if it makes sense, to let us know if it is easy to read, is it culturally appropriate, is it relevant? So the translation must use terms and ideas that make sense to the target audience, that resonate with them, and avoid anything that doesn't, even if it exists in the original text. And of course, we pay the community reviewers for their time. This benefits everyone. It benefits the audience, and it also benefits us at Refugee 643 because we get great feedback from the community reviewers. So one community reviewer shared with us some resources on the gender-inclusive use of their language. And another community reviewer suggested specific fonts that would best fit the language needs of that community. So I think many other language or many others might relate, but in my experience, Arabic, we have a lot of fonts. Arabic is my mother tongue, and not all of them, they all look pretty, but not all of them are easy to understand or read. So font can play a big role in delivering the information. So the messages, it is also important to note, community review. So it depends on the type or the format of the resource that you're creating or the content. Community review can or should be done at multiple stages, before and after the design stage. If you're producing something that needs to be designed, like a flyer, like an infographic, a video, always make sure to have a community reviewer look at that resource after the design stage. Some softwares are not really compatible with every language out there and can mess up the order of the letters or their alignment, which leads to an accurate translation being really unreadable. So you would need to avoid doing that. That's why community review is important to happen at different stages. By incorporating community feedback into our content creation process, we build trust, we improve our accuracy, and ensure our materials are accessible and understandable to the communities we serve. Next slide, please. Information equity and language preferences. when important information is hard to access for newcomers, it makes it more difficult and more stressful to fully embrace the integration and their lives in Canada. It is vital to understand the needs and preferences of different newcomer populations to make sure they are not marginalized in the flow of information. When you treat all audiences the same, which is the easiest and most common tactic for communicators, it results in information delivery that isn't designed for people outside mainstream information channels. And yet, so often, those are the people most in need of the information. Next slide, please. So in other words, by continuing to deliver official communication in English and or French only, we will fail to recognize the distinct needs of newcomers and racialized audiences. We will foster what we call an inequitable information flow. One of the areas in which we are still learning is determining which languages we should translate our content into. We do not have enough money to translate into every language that is spoken across Canada. So we are forced to make hard decisions, unfortunately. And we know that many public institutions like hospitals or government departments rely on data from Statistics Canada, for example, to choose the languages that they need to translate to and guide their translation decisions. But at Refugee 613, we also rely heavily on what our partners on the ground tell us is in demand. For example, we recently added Ukrainian and Turkish to the list of languages we translate to after service providers told us that they need these languages to support their clients. But we are concerned that we are still missing people, likely the most marginalized, unfortunately, who aren't accessing services or who don't speak any English or French. For example, we know that numerically speaking, there are a lot more Tagalog speakers in Ottawa than there are Dari speakers. But we know that the Dari speakers are more in need of the informations or some of the resources that we share, so we choose to translate to Dari over Tagalog for that reason. We hope that this year we will develop a more rigorous and evidence-based approach. And as I mentioned earlier, we are still learning and navigating our way through these decisions. So we would love to chat to you. If you have any feedback or if you have some insights that can help with our decisions, please let me know. I'll share some ways we could connect towards the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So this is the multilingual info bank that I mentioned at the beginning. If you would like to see more examples of our multilingual digital content, you could simply scan the QR code you see, or just, do I see the URL here? Yes, there's a URL, so newcomer-infobank.ca. It's a free website. It's accessible to everyone with many multilingual resources created by us, but also things that we think are trusted and really essential for newcomers from other sources, Canadian or international sources. If you have your own multilingual resources that you would like to share with a wider audience, or you'd like to add them to the info bank, you could just visit the Submit Resources page. You'll find it on the home page and learn how to do that. And of course, we're happy to collaborate if you have any ideas, or if you want to offer, if you want us to offer advice for making your content multilingual and accessible to newcomers. And I'd just like to add, the website itself is available in both English and French, but we're also working to make it available in many other languages. Next slide, please. Yes, so that's it from me. I hope I didn't take more time than was allocated. But it has been great connecting with you today, and I hope this is the beginning of more conversations about language. And you could see there are a few ways you can connect with us. You could just send an email to the info@refugee613.ca. We monitor this email every day, so we'll get back to you very soon. And if you scan the QR code, you could join our mailing list and receive updates on whenever we have new multilingual content available. Social media and website as well available. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, Leila. I said Laila originally, Leila. So there's Thea online and the three of you here. So I'm curious, Thea actually quickly mentioned UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm curious about how that declaration has supported the work Thea, Rebecca, and Elaine have been doing with regard to revitalization and preservation of Indigenous languages.
That's a really good question. And actually, I think a better question might be UNDRIP itself or what has been implemented as UNDRIP in Canada, because they're two different things. I can hear Toa Hande looking at me. A lot of this, unfortunately, comes down to funding. I dislike that that is the truth, but it is the truth. When we look at the funding numbers, at least several years ago, out of, I believe it was 2018, and we broke down the amount of funding that was available by the Government of Canada in particular, and that was divided by the number of communities that would require that money. It was something like $30,000 per year per community. $30,000 is not enough to do anything. And this is not to say that progress has not been made and that it's not being made. But initiatives require support, and in a lot of cases they require that support immediately because the people that are speaking these languages are dying. That was certainly the case of Cayuga, and I know that Elaine mentioned Cayuga. In the United States, there were 7 speakers of Cayuga at one point. I'm happy to say that I've heard the youth speak Cayuga at Six Nations fluently. So it's on its way back. But so much of that has to do with the communities finding a way to do that themselves. Mm-hmm. So maybe the better question becomes, how does one, and I think that this is true of everything in terms of policy to praxis. Policy is one thing and praxis is something else. So right now, the question is less about the policy itself and more about what does that mean in terms of praxis. I think that there are some initiatives going on right now out of the UN, in particular, the reason that we're here, but also the Decade for Indigenous Languages and initiatives like that, I think bring awareness, but there's a difference between bringing awareness and
support.
Well, and support means different
Like
things to different.
tangible.
It means different things to different people as
Right.
well, right? It can't be a one size fits all for each community
Right.
and for each language. So, I think it's a good start.
Mm-hmm. But it's insufficient. I see Tia is on.
Thanks for that question. I think the importance of UNDRIP is really links back to what I was talking about in my presentation, in that this is work for everyone. And I think that UNDRIP signals to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to newcomers, to leadership, to everyone, that this needs to be a priority. That it needs to be a focus, and it takes everyone's effort, and that it comes down to kind of our rights. And we often say that language is not a privilege, it's a right. You know, we should be born with our language, and we should be able to be raised and to understand and see the world through the lens of our languages. And so I think that with the implementation of UNDRIP, it hopefully signals to all of the groups of people that need to be touching this work, that need to be involved in this work, that they have a place and that they need to be here, and that we need everyone, that it takes a community. And again, we all have to work to rebuild that ecosystem of language diversity, you know, the beauty of this language landscape. So yeah, I see UNDRIP as being you know, a stepping stone to where we need to go together.
Thanks for that, Dr. Gold.
Yes, if there are a few people who don't know that acronym, it's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Government of Canada did pass an acceptance of this. Of course, what it means in funding is something else again. The other thing I just want to mention, it's also the UN Decade of Indigenous Languages, so specifically on languages. And again, what does that mean? Doesn't necessarily mean there's any more money, but it does create an environment that encourages projects for supporting Indigenous languages and reclamation efforts. So it's a good thing.
Yes.
We try to take part.
Leila, I had a question about the Circle for Reconciliation, because, you know, you get newcomers who come here now at a time when there's all this work that's going on and a lot of awareness, especially around the residential schools, the children, and now this reclaiming of Indigenous cultures, things like land acknowledgement and things like that. So how do you impart this awareness and knowledge to newcomers?
Yeah, one way is by working with, the example I gave at the beginning when I did the land acknowledgement is working with subject experts to create resources for newcomers, also putting our expertise, you know, knowing what formats newcomers prefer, and kind of summarizing the information, like just sending the most important messages, not overwhelming them with like 100 pages document that, you know, gives them all the information there is about the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation at once, because that's not going to work. But yeah, and one of our goals for the next couple of years is actually to do more and create more resources, collaborate with more subject experts from Indigenous organization or people from Indigenous communities to better inform newcomers, because we know there's an information gap there. Again, I can speak from personal experience. There's really not so much out there that helps a newcomer understand the real history of the Indigenous people, what reconciliation really means, what they can do to support Indigenous people and kind of educate themselves, what resources to go to really educate themselves. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
No, it does. It does. Great. I'm going to look more into it. I'm really curious about that. And if there's anybody in the room with questions, you can just put up your hand. Or online. We have a question online. Oh, so you have inspired somebody to want to learn one or several Indigenous languages and eventually become an interpreter in one or more of those languages. Where would one go to learn that? I think Rebecca and Dr. Gold are the two best people, and Thea as well. Like, how do you go about that if you are absolutely non-Indigenous language speaker?
So this is going to vary from city to city, and there is information online, but I certainly believe that if you want to actually achieve some fluency, that you need an in-person instruction and can't be done completely online. So I can speak primarily for Toronto, and I think we'd have to speak, depending where the person who's asking the question lives. The universities have taken very seriously the calls to action from Truth and Reconciliation about education on languages. So most universities now are offering language courses, and just depending where you live, it's going to depend which languages are being offered there, but you can certainly take them at universities. I know that there are Indigenous centers, for example, in Toronto. The Native Cultural Center has language courses that you can take there. So those are the places I'd look. There aren't lots and lots of places, but most cities definitely have some programs in some languages, and it really depends which language you want to learn.
I'd say this is actually depends a lot on a couple of different factors. So as Elaine said, I learned Anishinaabe at University of Toronto, but I learned it prior to it being actually offered as a course, which is a funny story that I have to tell you later, involving field methods. So there are things to think about, and Elaine talked a little bit about cities. What I know comes from really being in the communities, grassroots level. I think there's some discussion and some thought to be had when talking about non-Indigenous people learning an Indigenous language, because there are going to be different opinions about that. And again, I can hear you staring at my head. So I have only ever taken very basic level language classes because, and this is just my personal experience is I do not want to take space in a language class for someone whose right it is to speak that language. And again, it's personal, right? I also have a lot of access to people that do speak the language. So for me, I think it's my responsibility to actually not take classes. It's more my responsibility, because I have the training and because I have the techniques, to learn it on my own, because I just don't feel right taking up that space.
We need all the spaces we possibly can get for our children and for our young adults to learn and acquire the language. We're under terrible pressure. And so I acknowledge what Rebecca does. She's absolutely right. It's the wrong thing to take up space that's needed for our own people. However, by being engaged in a 100% supporting role in the community, she has access to first language speakers so she can hear the language on the land in a cultural context, which is really what it's about. You can't learn anything about an Indigenous language in a classroom that's meaningful.
Yes.
This is where we get into fights.
That's the academic approach.
You can learn the grammar and you can learn the structure, right?
Yeah.
But I think the point is, as I was discussing before, is that there's such a small part of this much larger whole.
Right.
The other thing that I want to say, and frankly, I mean, Thea, FCPP is an excellent place to go and look for any of that information. I've used it before. I think it made its way into my dissertation, to be honest. I met Rachel Perkins, by the way. This is what happens. We all know each other, right? And so we start talking about, I know this person. But there are places to go online to learn. There are places in the communities themselves to learn, and it just takes some digging. But if you are going to go and do that, I think it's really important to make that connection with the community. Mm-hmm. So, I learned the beginning Ganyak Geha program through his community, his reserve, because that was where I was supposed to go. So I think that it's important to understand that there are a lot of different thoughts about that whole thing, but what has been emphasized to me over and over again, and maybe Thea, you can talk about this a little bit more, is it's not just the language. You really have to make the connection to the community, to the people. You need to do that work to have, to understand not just the language, but all of those other aspects that we've been talking about. And I think that's the more important thing is, if you do want to learn the language, that's great. Go work on the relationship first.
Yeah. Can we hear from Thea, since you mentioned her?
Yeah. Thanks for both of your comments. I think Dr. Eileen and Rebecca, I echo a lot of what you said, in that, I think you can search kind of what's in your city or what's local to you. And certainly Indigenous people and the communities must be centered in this work. And it's certainly worthwhile, I would say, and I would encourage you to explore how you can come alongside and walk alongside communities, as opposed to kind of out front or even behind, and just really take your cues from them and explore what it means to be, kind of working with reciprocity throughout that process. Other things that I can add, certainly there's organizations like ours that can kind of make some of the connections that you might be interested in making. If it feels appropriate, it sometimes might be helpful to connect with the community that you're hoping to support. A lot of communities that we work with have programs that are available in urban spaces, and those programs can be open to the public. I think other things that maybe to be aware of is, as we see this kind of uptick in the need, and certainly where communities are going in terms of language planning, there might even be opportunities to see if the communities near you have a language revitalization plan, and see where you might fit into that bigger picture, and understand again how you can come alongside. Our Ganigihà cousins there have incredible language plans that we have taken as a model. And Rebecca's so right that we do share, and we're all connected in this work. And so definitely, I think as I see more language revitalization plans come forward, I think that worthwhile to explore those and see where you can stand in that work alongside communities.
Thanks, dear. Are there any other questions online? Yes. So it's a question about African languages, because Leila did mention the 20 languages, and this person online noticed that African languages were absent, which isn't true. Swahili was mentioned. Swahili is a very commonly spoken language, mainly throughout East Africa and Central Africa. But it's true, it's the one language, despite the fact that there's an increasing number of Burundian and Rwandan and Lingala speaking refugees coming into this region. So the person wants to know if there's any thought to increasing the number of African languages offered by Refugee 613.
The answer is yes, and why not? And I think it depends. So what I've mentioned towards the end is sometimes, we are forced to make those hard decisions for several reasons. Funding is one of them, and also sometimes it's what our partners are asking us to do. And sometimes it's maybe it is easy to find a professional translator to translate into some of the African languages, but it's hard to find a community reviewers. So, I mean, we would love to have more, to be able to have more African languages, like translate resources to more African languages. And I will take that as a piece of feedback.
Yeah. Well, hence the challenge of what are the choices in terms of the 20 languages. You also have to look at demographics, like the demand, the number. As the number increases, I suppose.
Yes, but I've also mentioned that it's not always how we make the decision. So just because a certain language is spoken by more people doesn't mean that's what drives our decision. If we can identify somehow that there's a high need for people who speak, like a high information gap on certain topics, for people who speak that certain language, then we definitely would prioritize translating the resources into that language.
That's fair. I hope the viewer is satisfied with that response. Are there questions in the room?
I represent a company, CanTalk Canada. We offer immediate interpretation over the phone. We've been doing it for almost 30 years. I'm with my colleagues here. And there's a real polarization or a dichotomy, and I'm trying to balance this out in my own mind, so I'm sure you can help me. So we have many clients across Canada and throughout North America, and they want to use language services. They want and need language support for all their many variations, be it for profit or not for profit. And we help them with thousands of exchanges every day. But where are the Indigenous languages? Clients want them, but there are no Indigenous speakers to support. Not enough, not willingly, not very often, and we reluctantly have to find them. So it seems to us, and we've had many conversations around the table, this is the best opportunity in the world if the clients don't just ask for it, but they are given the support from the Indigenous communities to be there, to continue to ensure the viability and the vitality of Indigenous languages. Now hold that thought in your mind just for a moment. Now on the other side of the fence, we have clients, again, many varieties, and they are continuing to escalate in requesting many different forms of languages. When I first started the company, you couldn't drag a dead horse to a trough. No one wanted, they thought it was a wonderful idea, but no client group wanted to pay the money for language support. So at some point, there's two conflicting worlds. On one hand, you see the ramp up and you ask yourself, does it go beyond just a newcomer needing the language support? Should language continue to be a right for the continuation of language and culture always? Otherwise, it does get lost. I was speaking with someone who lost Russian, I'm sorry, wherever you are, and right there. And we were reminiscing and regretfully having to come to the realization that we've lost. Our parents spoke, but we don't have them. So through that, we have lost certain elements of culture and understanding. So the company like CanTalk, I'm not promoting CanTalk, I'm saying after many years of experience, these are observations. Many clients are endorsing, they see the relevance, they are there to support language for however long that preference needs to be requested. This is good, is it? Is it just newcomers? Does privilege stop when you learn English? I don't know. Should it always continue? But on the other hand, there's definitely will to move forward the Indigenous languages into arenas that they've never been before and to establish the cultures, to ground them. But it's not being utilized. We're not being utilized, and we're being placed in a difficult position to try and have those languages as a baseline.
I can answer from the Indigenous languages perspective. I know Elaine can answer from language contact perspective. We're talking, in the case of Indigenous languages, we're talking about languages that have been taken. We're not talking about languages that have evolved of their own accord and become something else, which happens in language shift. We're talking about people that we know, so that I know personally, that had, and I'm sorry, I am going to give you a content warning. This is not going to be very pleasant. We're talking about people who had kerosene rags put into their mouths for speaking their language. We're talking about people that were beaten. We're talking about people that in one case had a needle put through his tongue for speaking the only language that they knew. Okay. Awareness, I think, is extremely important. But what is important to be aware of? When we're talking about language, when we're talking about, well, people want this and people want that, and they're requesting these things, what is the nature of the request and what is the purpose of the request? How do the Indigenous communities and the people that speak these languages benefit from that work? That is the question. Are they working directly with Indigenous people? Do the Indigenous people whose language, this is their language, are they benefiting from that request? That's the sole question right now. And to do that, I mean, I can't tell you that. The communities tell us that, right? So if someone, and this has happened to me more than once, that someone has come up and said, well, I'm starting a business. How do I say this in Anishinaabe? What community are you from? Well, I'm not Indigenous. Then why do you want to use an Indigenous word? Is it to promote this product, to promote yourself as having a certain, it's marketing, right? And branding. Is that, yeah, I am going to use this word. Is that moral? Is that moral for a people that have been through what they have been through, for someone else who didn't have that experience, to then profit off of that thing that was taken from them? That's what needs to be weighed. Okay. And yeah, you can see I'm a little shaky because I know these people. I know people personally. Okay. Like we do, right? So, yeah. That is the first part for me, is I think when people have those requests, there needs to be a discussion, and the discussion needs to be specifically, why are you making this request and how are the people whose language it is going to benefit from it? And unless that question, I mean, maybe it is, well, can you help us with introductions to the community? Can you help us establish those relationships so that we can have a better understanding of what it is we're actually asking? Okay, that's fine. That's something else, right? So for me, and again, I preface this and everything that I say in the way that I learned from the Kanien'kehá:ka, which is to say, this is my experience, okay? And yeah, I have learned much of the knowledge that I have about working with Indigenous communities, almost all of it, really, from the Kanien'kehá:ka. I do follow what we call Te Ohari Gaswenda, the Two-Row Wampum. That is the Two-Row Wampum. That's a treaty that my ancestors made with his ancestors. I have to live that. That's my responsibility. But I think, and I see this kind of periodically, that it's not just my ancestors and his ancestors. It's all of us. That is the agreement that we came to. And that is how I honor that agreement. And it establishes that way for all of us. Mm-hmm. So if that's the path that I follow, I mean, I think that everybody has the possibility of interrogating that, interrogating that process, and interrogating that thought process.
That's excellent. Centering Indigenous First Nations folks. Which brings me to that question, cultural appropriation. I mean, we had it with Swahili, with Hakuna Matata. Yakim, you can relate when Disney comes up with Hakuna Matata as if there aren't people who speak that language, apparently, and big fight. So can we talk a little bit about cultural appropriation and reclaiming Indigenous languages, Tia?
Yeah, sure. That's a big question. It's a complex conversation, and I think it's a conversation that happens with community. I feel like this is the theme of our discussion here, is that, again, we always have to take our lead from community and honor and respect Indigenous knowledge, heritage, rights, and sovereignty. And I think I get this question a lot, actually, not just in my work, but elsewhere as well. And I think it really does, I mean, talk about interrogate your own relationship to Indigenous peoples, to the nations here, and to the language. I think it requires a little bit of understanding, doing a self-location, understanding again where you stand in the work, and how you can come alongside, and it can be tough. I know when we start to use words like extinct or urgency and all these things, it can kind of create some big feelings around we need to act fast, but not at the risk of harming Indigenous peoples and the good work that's been done so far. That's always the priority, is the people, and really honoring the rebuilding of their systems, of their economies, social systems, governance systems, their cultural heritage and language, really honoring the rebuilding of that before we start to step in, and think that we can take pieces of that for ourselves. I think it's really critical, again, just to always lift up communities and the good work. And it's a complex conversation. And I think it's a conversation that goes beyond even this dialogue. I think it's something that you can speak to people who have the same questions. I think we're really fortunate at FPCC to have a real diversity in our staff, people Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and we all have our own relationship to this work. And so, I encourage always people who have those big questions or big feelings to connect with people of similar background or, similar heritage, because there's just a lot of insight to be shared about, again, how we be in right relations with the work, with the language, with the land, with the communities, and it can be tough, but it's so worthy, and it's so worthwhile to settle in to that good relationship, that right relationship with communities. So
I think that's a very good point on which to end. Thank you so much, Thea, for that. We are a little past noon, and there's a whole afternoon of activity, but thank you so much for all of your insights, and especially for the work that you continue to do to make sure that our Indigenous languages live on this Turtle Island. And thank you very much to Laila Jude from Refugee 613 for giving us the newcomer perspective, Dr. Gold for that wonderful exhibit. I'll have to go back there and you can look at it over the lunch hour. Rebecca, the amazing work you're doing with mapping Indigenous languages, and your husband who supports that work, and all of you for your attention. And I'm sure you're going to share out your contact information to continue the conversation over the lunch hour. Thank you so much.